Welcome, everyone. My name is Mara Gittleman. I am the Workshops and Education Coordinator for NYC Parks GreenThumb. We are the part of the Parks Department that works with community gardens across the city. And I'm so excited to be here tonight with some amazing speakers who are going to teach us what they know about advocating for discretionary funding from your elected officials. So we're excited to be here on Zoom. We're going to ask folks to stay muted and please use the chat for all questions. My colleague Bill will be collecting all of your questions and holding on to them until the end when we're ready for Q&A. We are recording tonight's presentation and we'll make it available on our YouTube channel. And I'm going to have the recording pinned to our speakers, but you can decide whether or not your camera is on using the little camcorder icon at the bottom of your screen. If you haven't yet, we invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat. We would love to hear who you are, where you're tuning in from, if you're part of a community garden or a Parks Conservancy or any other organization. We'd like to see who's joining us. And yeah, we're so excited to be here tonight. So I am pleased to introduce Matt Drury, who is the Director of Government Relations at NYC Parks, Sarah Williams-McCollum, who's the Executive Director at Green Guerillas, and Robert Atterbury. You will have to tell me all of your titles, but he has a lot of experience within this realm, both as someone who has advocated for funding and someone who has worked for elected officials. So what are we talking about when we're talking about and is also a gardener with Hooper Grove Community Garden. So we're gonna do a quick presentation and then hear from our panelists about their experiences. And then we're gonna have a nice long time for Q&A. So again, if you're just joining us, please, any questions you have throughout, go ahead and put them in the chat. We are gonna keep track of them until Q&A. So what is a capital project? Anything greater than $50,000, a project that will be in place for more than 5 years. What does that mean for GreenThumb gardens? Typically for us, fence installation and on-site water installation, sidewalk reconstruction, bigger projects that involve a lot of moving pieces. This is a really lovely before and after of a fence installation at Jane Street Garden in the West Village. You can see on the left, they had an old chain link fence that got replaced with a beautiful wrought iron fence. That was a capital project. Water installation, getting a water hookup on site in the garden. This one is at Green Oasis Community Garden in Manhattan. And another example is sidewalks. This garden had no sidewalks, and then GreenThumb was able to work with city agencies to make sure that the sidewalks were there and accessible. Elected official funding streams, and Matt, jump in probably here once we go through this, but their funding streams come from different places. Your borough president typically gets around $20 million. The city council members typically get $5 to $6 million, but it changes. And then some of those council members dedicate $1 to $1.5 million of that capital funding towards participatory budgeting. There are also local initiatives like the Parks Equity Initiative, which a lot of community gardens get funding through. And so we are going to be talking about, I think, two different ways that garden groups can access this funding. One is advocating for funding that gets allocated to the Parks Department, which are those projects that you saw earlier, like in-ground water, new fencing, new sidewalks, things like that get allocated to the Parks Department, and we handle the project. So generally speaking, in broad strokes, you would meet with your outreach coordinator to discuss the garden's ideas and goals, whether that's any of the projects I listed or another major project. You would first meet with your outreach coordinator, and then you can advocate with your local representatives to fund the project. And Sarah and Robert are going to talk more about that. And then the council member or other elected official will announce their budget. The other way that we'll discuss is through nonprofits. And so larger entities that have the capacity to take on this kind of big project. It's a lot of administration. It's a lot of paperwork. Sarah has experience with this. I think Robert also has experience with this. It's so the funding can also go through nonprofits as well. And then they are responsible for implementation. I'm going to back up and let Matt jump in here to explain any pieces that I maybe haven't gotten to yet, and then we'll talk about the timeline.
Sure. Thanks so much, Mara, and thanks everybody for joining tonight. We're very excited. Obviously, our community gardens are a hugely important part of the parks portfolio, and the community building and all the great activity that happens there, keeping those spaces activated is tremendously important to the agency. So we really appreciate it. And more to the point, we really appreciate, the individual gardeners that are giving their time and sweat and making those spaces very special, and engaging with their local elected officials to make sure that they're aware of how important those gardens are for everybody. To that end, I think that's sort of where we get into the notion of discretionary funding. So just to take a quick step back to kind of frame, and I apologize if some of this is, Schoolhouse Rock 101 for everybody, but essentially speaking, when we say discretionary funding, we're referring to city tax dollars, that are repurposed and directed at the discretion or at the direction of an elected official. So theoretically, just to kind of break, not to go through all the branches of government, but, theoretically there's funding available from, federal funding sources, or state funding sources, your local assembly member, your local state senator. They have some access to discretionary funding that can be directed towards specific projects. It's less common, and when it does become available, it's usually for sort of larger mega projects. So I don't believe that'll be the focus today. Always happy to talk about, federal and state sort of processes. Maybe we do that offline, or happy to answer questions maybe during Q&A if that's a focus. But I think the city funding that's available is the primary focus. And as Mara noted, some of that can come towards the agency directly to be administered through our capital projects or other divisions. And some of that can obviously be funding that is directed towards an organization that's eligible to be a recipient for those funds. And those are sort of two different buckets of funding, if you will. Quickly, I think Mara covered, I think, the difference between capital and what we call expense funding, but just to kind of and maybe back up one more, if you want to, Mara, go to the definition of capital eligibility. I think it might have been the first or second slide. I think it's worth kind of making the clear, just not to bore everybody with the gory details, but essentially capital funding is funded by the issuance of city bonds. It's essentially borrowed money that can be amortized over many years. So it's for longer term infrastructure investments, and parks, thankfully, are considered among those. But it does speak to why the nature of the project is important in terms of determining whether it's capitally eligible or not. So, yes, it has to have an expected life of 5 years or more, but it also has to be, this is hard to explain, but it has to be part of what's called a comprehensive betterment. Like it has to, so like a single park bench, for example, would not be, capitally eligible, but an entire, a renovation that sort of, redoes an entire area that includes, some additional seating like benches, that would be capitally eligible. So fencing and this nature, things of that nature are capitally eligible and have been very successful. Sidewalk repair, other like paving, other elements like that, gates and entrances, water service, as was noted, are all capitally eligible, and great examples of targeted improvements that can make a big difference. And obviously, those funds are we're essentially nominated for those funds by an elected official, the borough president or council member in question, and at the budget adoption, which happens at like around June 30th, July 1st every year. So the budget year in New York City runs from July through June. It's a little unusual. It's not a calendar year. So the negotiations and the various decisions lead up to that budget adoption start getting made around now. So now is actually an extremely timely window for you to be getting this information, because now is a perfect time for you to be reaching out to your elected officials and making sure they know how important, your local garden is. And if there are any targeted improvements that, could require funding, now's the time to kind of quickly convene that conversation. But, if it's a longer term project with a really significant cost, that may be something where you kind of have to work with your outreach coordinator and to kind of build a consensus, build an advocacy campaign around it where you're, targeting certain elected officials and kind of trying to build a bigger vision that, that can take a little longer, sometimes multiple years. I know Robert's been involved in some longer term projects that, took years to come to fruition, in terms of the funding and all the other various pieces that had to come into play. But so patience is a virtue, of course, but so is, resiliency and, stick-to-itiveness, as they say. So capital funding, I think, is sort of for larger projects. And again, there is also expense funding, which is a portion of the city's annual budget, sort of our operating budget. So salaries, supplies, things of that nature that are spent during the course of a fiscal year. And, it's essentially the city's day-to-day budget, if you will. That's expense funding. And a small portion of that is set aside for some elected officials, namely the council members, to allocate to specific, either to agencies or to specific organizations. And I know Sarah and others have experience as awardees, then they're technically considered vendors of the city, that then, are able to deliver goods and services for New Yorkers and then get reimbursed through the city's process. So I hope that covers the basics in terms of what discretionary funding is, but each elected official has a pool of funding that they, the council members and the borough presidents, that they, each year kind of make a determination of how to allocate at their discretion. Obviously they hear from a lot of different parties. Some voices are louder than others. And so, how you position yourself and get out there and lobby for your garden or for your, preferred project, is a conversation I hope we can kind of continue to have, because there are little sort of tricks of the trade, if you will, to kind of make sure that you're putting, your garden front and center in front of those elected officials.
Thank you, Matt. That was really helpful. I appreciate the overview of what we're actually talking about here. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Sarah, I think, to share your story and experience, so we can get some firsthand accounting of how this goes sometimes. And then after Sarah, I'll ask Robert to speak.
Great. Thank you so much, Mara, and thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. Welcome, everyone. I just made a couple of slides to share a little bit about Green Guerillas, the ways that we've been in touch with electeds to, secure discretionary funding, but wanted to just share quickly, our values and sort of focus areas for this year. I know some of you on the call I've seen before and met before, but some of you I haven't. So Green Guerillas has been around for almost 50 years, supporting community gardens across New York City. These are some of the areas that, we're working into, always working to learn and grow. We're a very small organization. I'm the only full-time staff member, and then we have 2 part-time staff members who are co-directors of our Youth Empowerment Pipeline program. And so in amongst the different areas of focus that we have and work that we do, one of the most important things that we do is to connect gardeners with resources. And so applying for and then stewarding discretionary funding is an important part of that for us. And I wanted to share a couple of examples of the types of funding that we've applied for, and then the types of projects that we've undertaken with that funding. For this fiscal year, the city's fiscal year runs from July 1st of any given year to June 30th. So we're sort of right in the middle, a little past the halfway point of the fiscal year. I'm sorry, this is I meant 2022 for this current fiscal year. We're working with Councilmember Ayala and tried to circle on the map crudely here, where just geographically where the council districts are that we've been working in. And then I also noted we've had this year in particular is a huge year for turnover and new city council members coming in. So that's also been a big change for us in terms of like establishing new relationships, building new connections with city council members. So I put sort of in parentheses, with a kind of outgoing council member's name there. So for this year, we're working in council districts 8, 9, 16, 36, 2, 14, and 26. And most of those funds are around $10,000 or even, $15,000. I think as an outlier, Diana Ayala, who's a very big supporter of urban agriculture, we have a discretionary funding from her for $40,000, and that's like a much larger amount than what we usually steward. But that's in part due to some of the particular projects that she has in the district and that she wants us to be working with her on and undertake. So for us in some previous years, some of the types of things that we've been able to help with, and this slide is from Padre Plaza Success Garden in the South Bronx, is, helping to purchase supplies like the wood that you see here, some of the tools, and then also to organize volunteers around completing projects like this. So this was a gazebo building project that was undertaken in 2020. So here's like the team of volunteers and community gardeners with some of the supplies that were purchased thanks to the discretionary funds from Councilmember Ayala. And then here's the completed gazebo at the end. And so some of the things that we were able to do were to, help secure that lumber and the wood and the shingles and, the materials that were needed for the project were covered as part of those discretionary funds. And then related to that, we were able to organize folks who had special skills in actually executing a project of that size. We also do a lot of plant giveaways as well. So for seedlings, these are just a photo of, small amount of some of the seedlings that we've distributed. That's something that helps us sort of touch a lot of different gardens in a particular district, because we don't have the funds for or the capacity for doing a project like this at every garden, but we are able to reach gardens through something like this, where we're able to supplement their needs for food production or for reestablishing herbs or native pollinators. So that's another facet. That's another sort of way that we have spent and do spend discretionary funds. And then this is one of the market areas at Hattie Carthen Community Garden. And so we were able here, this is another one with like supplies and lumber, the garden steward there, Farmer Jan, runs a really robust market and youth program, and was in need of some supplies to help with the market. So we were able to purchase some lumber, purchase some paint, tools, to be able to help to support the important work that she's doing there. And then other fun, supporting other fun things. This was like, we were able to purchase like mushroom growing kits for folks who were doing a workshop on growing mushrooms and fungi. And so that was a cool way for us to support a project that's ongoing in a garden. and be able to, provide some resources to support the, community education efforts that are being undertaken in that garden. And then here on the other side, these are some like a children's area in a community garden in the Bronx. And this is sort of, about like helping gardens to create spaces that are important for their families, neighbors to come and share time, relax and enjoy the garden space as a place of, community restoration, relaxation. So those are some of the kinds of projects that we work with folks on through discretionary funds across the different districts that we receive those kinds of funds for. And, as Mara mentioned earlier, nonprofits can access funds to benefit garden groups, sometimes in ways that are through a bit of a different conduit than each garden group on an individual basis. And I wanted to talk a little bit through sort of like why that's the case, and sort of how that works. Well, I think one is that the city, and Matt, you can weigh in here, but the city will only grant discretionary funds to a nonprofit organization or to like a city agency. So it would not be like a garden group that it does not have nonprofit status. Is that correct?
Sorry, that's correct. Yeah, only a registered 501c3. It can be, and I believe there are some, you have to be essentially qualified to do business with the city, which requires, working with the mayor's office of contract services, and there's, sort of background check type, to sort of legitimize that entity as a payee of the city. Again, that's why they use our contracts team use the term vendor, and I know we don't really think about it and we wouldn't think about it in those terms like on a day-to-day process, but from the city's perspective in terms of a payer and a payee, they use that terminology. Right.
That makes sense. But so, one of the elements that's useful in terms of having, just the staff capacity to actually secure and administer the funding, there's a tremendous amount of time and effort that is involved in just the sheer paperwork involved. It's just like, it's just hundreds of pages of paperwork between the actual contracting process and then the reimbursement process. It's a staggering amount of work to be done, oftentimes for a fairly small amount of money. So this is an area where, to have an individual garden group undergo that amount of work would not be the right thing to do at all. So, in the case of a nonprofit, there's at least some staff capacity there to undertake, the administrative elements, which are not a small matter. And then beyond that, there's sort of the less tangible side, including relationships across networks. So, being able to have relationships with gardeners across a particular district and get to know those gardeners and get to understand what's happening in those gardens and learn about what projects are there, what needs are there, and then being able to go to a council member and say, yeah, these like 6 gardens really need like these major projects this year. And then of course there are kind of more general needs across all the gardens in the district, and sort of being able to present, in sort of one sweep, like here are some of the needs across the whole district. Obviously knowing that, we can't see or know everything. So there's, I'm sure, a lot that we're missing, but at least having those, relationships to the best of our ability across those networks can be useful in terms of actually communicating with the council member. And then that kind of dovetails into the next point, which is just sort of those relationships and kind of the ongoing outreach and relationship building, and really helping to build visibility for funding needs, and really, just asserting as clearly as possible how essential and vital the work of community gardens is, and how under provisioned that work is, and the really great need for greater support from the city for community garden spaces. So that's one of the things that we're able to undertake and continue to work and grow and build our abilities to do that. And then, just wanted to share, some kind of general, ideas for how to communicate to electeds about the projects that you're passionate about and that are of essential, need in the gardens. And I just kind of broke this down into a couple of things, and we sort of follow this kind of three-part structure ourselves. First really is, setting the context. What is the context? When you call or email your council member's office to request a meeting, let them know that you're a constituent. Let them know how long your community garden has been serving the district. Let them know the types of ways that your garden serves the district, because there's so many different ways that community gardens serve the community that have so much breadth and depth to them that it's oftentimes very inspiring and important to communicate just the many different ways that the garden is serving the district. So really kind of giving a brief context of who you are, who the garden is, what type of work you've been doing in the community through the garden, and then really defining the project. What is the big need? What is the proposed project? What are the issues that it addresses? And what are the resources that you need to address that? And then really important to this, I think, too, is sort of, why is this important? What is the impact of this in the community if this is implemented and achieved? So I think kind of being able to share across those different areas is really important. And, it's like right now is a super busy time to get in touch with council members, because since the deadline that I think Matt mentioned, that February 22nd deadline is coming up, which is the deadline for nonprofit organizations to submit their applications for discretionary funding requests. Council members are being inundated right now, sort of, but like between January and like that discretionary deadline, they're just being flooded with requests for meetings and phone calls. So it's a kind of difficult, especially for the newer council members. They're certainly getting a lot of requests right now, but they're also very generous with their time. I've found that putting a request out there in a clear and respectful way, if I don't get a reply on the first request, usually if I follow up by phone or email, I'll get a reply after that fairly quickly. And I also wanted to just share that, to the extent that we can, where we have a limited capacity, small staff, but you're also welcome to reach out to us. If we can help, we will help. That's not always possible, but if we can, we're happy to share meeting time or resources or make introductions or include your garden needs when we make requests to electeds. And, as we saw in the previous screen, we don't have relationships with all council members across the city. We sort of have kind of pockets of relationships that we've built over years, and we're looking to build more. But certainly in those districts that were highlighted there, where we already have relationships and oftentimes already have funding, let us know if there's a way that we can kind of combine our requests or help to elevate your requests. We'd be happy to do that. And then just wanted to say thank you for your vital work. As community gardeners across the city, you're doing tremendous work that is so needed, so important, and just wanted to express a deep appreciation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really helpful context. And thank you for your very generous offer of helping folks out with introductions and sharing meeting time and bringing their needs to the forefront at your meetings. That's really amazing. I highly recommend that gardeners take her up on that. Sarah, if you want to put your email address in the chat, that would be amazing. Before we move on to Robert, I want to echo what Matt said earlier in his explanation of expense versus capital funding, which I found really helpful. And I think what we're seeing between these two examples is a really good illustration of the difference between the two. Sarah, you're talking about expense discretionary funding, and Robert, you're about to tell us about capital discretionary funding. And I think we're talking about two very different scopes. Robert, you shared in the chat that fencing with 2 gates, in-ground water, and a replaced sidewalk came out to about $300,000 for one community garden. So Sarah, before we move on, would you be willing to share, like, how much money were we talking about? I remember on the phone with me, you shared that one group received about $10,000 for a dog run. Like, what are we talking about when you shared with us some examples of projects like that involved small structures with lumber? Yeah, can you give us some examples?
Examples of like the like kind of per project budget, or
yeah.
So, you know, for like a project like that, that gazebo, I think that ended up being about, oh gosh, it might have been about $6,000 or $7,000 for all of the materials and tools that were needed for that. But then we were able to save like a lot of money in other ways, because we found folks who had specialized skills who were able to donate their time to help with actually, you know, the construction on that. And so there were certain elements where, like, because we were like, you know, kind of working together creatively, we were able to do it in a less expensive way than, you know, we otherwise might have been able to. And then for the seedlings and seeds and that sort of element of things, you know, usually I try to offer as much as we possibly can to gardens on that front. So, you know, sometimes that depends on how much funding we have from the district. You know, if it's like, oh, we have 20,000 from the district, then we're like, okay, maybe we can like let, you know, anybody who replies to this, you know, order up to like $200 worth of seedlings, etc. But if we only have like $10,000, maybe that's, or there are a lot more gardens in the district that need to be, you know, to be served, then that's more like $100. So a lot of it is like a case by case, like how much do we have? How far can we stretch it? What are the biggest needs? And then we try to also be like as fluid with that as possible. Like if something pops up that's like a really urgent need, or, you know, or even like something that's, you know, kind of been on our like mind or like awareness for a while, but we just haven't seen that issue be addressed. You know, like one issue this year that we're working on is we're working with La Finca del Sur. That's the background. My virtual background is at La Finca there with the Metro North train in the background, and a major ongoing need for them is for greater security. They have suffered from numerous break-ins, a string of devastating break-ins over the past 2.5 years that has really decimated their tools, their supplies. And La Finca is a farm that is, has been serving the community, growing food for the community, for community distribution, and serving in so many different ways. I could use the whole session just talking about the different ways that La Finca is serving the community. And one of the elements that, you know, after many types of trying to troubleshoot, you know, where we've worked with La Finca to like reposition one of their storage containers, get new locks for the storage container, lights, cameras. We've tried so many different things in partnership with them to try to help with this issue, but nothing is resolving this. And so we're working together with them this year to help to bring about fencing solution. And so we're going to be using some of the funds that Councilmember Ayala dedicated to us to support that project. And we're hoping to be able to support by about $15,000 out of that $40,000 total to help with supplies, anything that's needed to help bring about a solution there. So some of it is a little bit like what, trying to be fluid, what's happening in the moment, but then also trying to meet needs that have been ongoing that we just haven't really been able to meet in different ways. And we also haven't been able to get help from anyone else on, where it's like, we need help, somebody needs to help us with this, but, different organizations or city agencies just haven't been able to fill in that gap. So if we're able to kind of work creatively on that, then we do. I don't know if that was very clear, but
thank you, Sarah. Matt,
the range.
Yeah, no, that was amazing. Thank you.
No, and I guess I wanted to follow up on that and just kind of provide, I did get a question in the chat that made me think that maybe this might be worth clarifying a little bit in terms of the differences, again, between whether you're a nonprofit or not, or expense and capital. And just, so let me try this, in that let's just say there are three categories of entities. Let's just say for argument, one is the agency, New York City Parks, part of the city of New York. The second category would be if you are a registered 501c3 that is eligible to receive funding, like Guerillas, for example, is the best example. And then the third category, let's say, is you are unincorporated, but a garden group. You exist, you're real, you have members, but you're not formally incorporated in a way that allows you to get funding. So if those are your three categories, the agency can receive capital funding and expense funding from council members. A nonprofit like Guerillas can receive expense funding, but not capital funding. So they can provide services and programs, supplies, things of that nature, but they can't oversee or conduct actual capital work on city property, right? And then the third is garden group, which isn't eligible to receive any funds, but is certainly free and in fact welcome to advocate for the other two categories to receive funding, if that makes any sense. And you can certainly work with us, and we want to make sure that it's being used in the best possible way. So you guys are in the conversation for sure, but not to be the direct recipient of those funds. So I hope that's helpful, because the question was whether a group can apply for both nonprofit discretionary funds and capital funds at the same time. But if that's the case, then you're probably in that second category, like Guerillas, in which case you're not really eligible to apply for capital funds per se. But you could certainly advocate for the city or for the agency to receive those discretionary funds. I hope that makes sense. I hope that was helpful.
Beautiful. That was great. Thank you. Thank you both, Sarah and Matt. I think we clarified a lot through this small exchange. I do want to make sure we have enough time to hear from Robert. So I'm going to invite you to share your story about capital improvements at Hooper Grove Community Garden. Thank you so much, Robert.
Of course. So first, hi, everyone. So my name is Robert Atterbury. I am co-chair of our board at Hooper Grove Community Garden. We're at South 5th and Hooper Street on the south side of Williamsburg. We are relatively new in the terms that we've been organizing around the lot since 2012. And we didn't get our keys from GreenThumb until 2016, 2017. And then we've gone through 3 seasons of construction on and off with Parks Department as a result of this great thing, which was our capital grant from our council member, who paid to replace our fence with a nice cast iron, or they're black steel now, black steel the curb, replace our entire sidewalk, give us in-garden water, which is an enormous thing to actually not have to hook up to our hydrant anymore, and a landing pad at the gates and a very small accessible pathway, so that we can do an accessible stand for folks who can want to garden from a wheelchair. I will tell you some just context of my experience. I currently am one of the executive presidents over at the Hudson River Park Trust. So we run the park piers along the west side of Manhattan. I've only been here for about a month though. Before this, I was the Deputy District Director for Congressman Jerry Nadler for just about 7 years. Before that, I was the Deputy Chief of Staff to State Senator Brad Hoylman. Before that, I was a liaison under another state senator. Before that, I was Director of Constituent Services for an Assembly member. So I've been working with communities from the elected official side for a long time. I would be used to be one of the first people that you would talk to when you go to engage your elected officials. You would end up talking to me. So when I give you guys in a minute, and I'll get to it, some advice on like how to engage with electeds, it's really based on my experience being on the other side, receiving that. Combined with my experience sort of with Hooper Grove, advocating with my local council member and others to help move projects forward. So we, on our Hooper Grove, we formed and we didn't have anything. We got we got our lot, it was HPD lot, we advocated, we organized much as you guys did, we did petitions, we went to our local community board, and we got our lot transferred from HPD to City Parks. City Parks leveled our lot because there was a big hill. They brought in some clean soil. They covered it in wood chips. And then they gave me a blank wood chip filled lot. It's gift, here are your keys. And then we had to build out from there. So growing my C was very helpful in building us some of our initial beds and what have you. But we still had our janky fence that was falling down. Our sidewalks were like this, the wild tripling hazards. And so one of the things we really did, and I think I did this because it was what I do professionally, was to make sure that our elected officials were engaged and at the table from sort of the beginning, right? When you're talking about this money, you're talking about discretionary money, which means it is fully at their pleasure. Your elected officials, your council members, your borough presidents can choose to give you this money or not choose to give you this money fully at their free and personal whim. And don't forget that. So we made sure that they were at the table from the beginning. I give regular updates to our local council member about what's going on. I reach out to our assembly member and our state senators regularly. I do somewhat with our former borough president. His office was less interested, although now he's the mayor, so great for him. Our former council member, who is very familiar with us because he lives just down the street, is now our borough president. So I think we're gonna have more input with him, but like just hoping if I bother him at the grocery store. So the important piece when it comes to talking about elected officials, and I will say this, so like we advocated for it. We had a list, our wish list of items. We wanted water, we wanted electricity, we wanted a new fence. We prioritized, and I really thought we were only gonna be able to get the fence. But by keeping our council member in particular, because this is largely council funds, at the table. So every time we have an event, I let them know. And there's a series of tips, I'll do this. By bringing them in to see you as the community organization that you are, as a collection of their constituents for whom they would like to have a good relationship, is a wildly important piece of getting yourself to the front of the line for it. And what I want to remind you is that, like, you got to remember, they have a million competing things. You are competing for the same pot of money as senior centers, as playgrounds, as every school in their district, as every museum in their district. You are competing for money for everyone, every community organization that you know and love in your neighborhood. You are competing for funding against them. And there's a limited pot of money, it's capped. So like the money to you means not money to somebody else, which is why I would say don't despair if you don't get it your first round. If you go through the process and you engage with them and you don't get it, don't despair. It takes time. It takes time to build a relationship. It takes time to engage them. It takes time for them to see you as that community resource. But being a community resource for them is how you get to the front of the line. They have to see you as a coalition of engaged community members, which you all are, that they want to help improve. They want to help support your work in your community because that's what they are also there to do. You guys have an aligned mission. And so like these folks can talk more about the technical pieces. I'll be honest, we didn't go through a lot of the technical pieces. I wrote up what I wanted. I asked what I wanted for, but your council member is actually going to be the one who can help you through it. The applications change every year. The process where you submit them changes every year. Actually having a good relationship with your council member is how they are the best resource to help counsel you through the process, which they are willing and happy to help you do, because you're the type of organizations that they want to apply for this funding. You're the type of organizations that they want to engage. You just have to figure out how to engage with them back, because it is a reciprocal relationship. You have something they want, they have something you want, and you guys got to find a way to build the relationship so that you are engaging. You are offering your access to your community. You are offering their participation. You are offering your thanks and gratitude in building their relationship. So these are, I have a couple of do's and a couple of don'ts, and then I have some approaches on how to really engage and build that relationship. And I will say these apply to all elected officials, and I would encourage you to do them with all your elected officials. Elected officials work in an ecosystem. Politics is an ecosystem. So your council member may know you and love you, but your senator and if your assembler and state senator and your assembly member don't, they're going to think you're less important, because the people they know and the people whose opinion that matters to them, which are their colleagues, other people in politics, don't know you. You don't exist. So versus an organization that is connected across the board. So you should engage your council member, your assembly member, and your state senator all the time. All three of them, your borough president, if you can, depends on your borough president. And just really, because it's pretty low bar stuff to start the relationship, and then you get advances from there. So the first one is early, often, be communicative. You can always give them an update. Your elected officials have a liaison who covers your area. They are your geographic. Sometimes they'll divide it by community board. Sometimes they'll divide it by neighborhood. Sometimes their issue, they might have a parks liaison or someone who handles parks or community garden issues. You're going to want to find who that person is that works for the elected officials. You're going to want to know their name. You're going to have their email address. You're going to want to know their phone number. And then you're going to want to just communicate with them. They're there to receive it. They may not always respond to you, but like keeping them up to date about what's happening is important. Remember that it takes time. So you're going to reach out. You're not going to get much of a response always. Sometimes it's going to seem like they're not that excited about you, and that's okay. You're going to make them excited about you over time. I would also say all your personal politics. We are apolitical organizations. We are community gardens. We are not political organizations. The agencies that you work with are not political organizations. This is government, and you're engaging with them as government officials, not as political actors. We don't tell people who to vote for. We don't engage in political politics. All of that is aside. We're here to talk about parks and community engagement and how we build up parks together. So all your personal feelings about your local elected officials, whether you love them, well, not if you love them, particularly if you hate them, you got to put that aside. You're talking to them in their official government capacity. Whether or not you like them is not the goal here. They are your representatives. They should represent you, whether or not you actually like them. Sorry to say, and I can see Parks Department people making faces at me, but like it's got to be said. Sometimes you don't, and that's okay. But that's not part of this conversation.
No, not to cut you off, Robert, but I would think I would go a step further, and that's absolutely 100% true. But I don't think we should forget that elected officials are by definition political animals. So not that there would ever be a quid pro quo or anything like that, but I think when you getting access to that community, getting to meet people, like what's in it for them is getting reelected or gaining in stature in the community. So there's a degree to which, and I'm not saying elected officials are craven or driven by that per se. They obviously want to be helpful first and foremost as public servants, but but I think there is an advantage to be held if you have X number of members in your garden and you invite them on to a gathering or a program that you guys are doing. That's them meeting like 20 new people that have families, that have neighbors, that have. So there is, we shouldn't lose sight that
Let me get to my my talking points, man. So I would want to say, make sure you have a purpose for taking their time, particularly if you're going to get involved with the elected official themselves, but also their staff. make sure you have a goal. Do you want to tell them about an event? Pass along an event invitation. Do you want to ask for their help with a problem? Are you making a request? Don't just eat up their time. These are people who will have, and I have been on this, during budget season, they have meetings every 15 minutes for 7 to 8 hours straight for days on end of people asking for money. So like, don't just waste their time. Don't make them run around in circles. Sometimes the answer is going to be no. Sometimes you got to hear a no. Like, I'm not saying don't push back, but like, also don't make sure that you are using your window in front of them effectively. That means a lot of prep on your end to go in knowing what it is you want and having the information on hand to help them get it for you. So you want to know exactly what it is you are asking for before you sit down at the table so that you can have an informed conversation from your end. With that, I would say, and this is a tool I use, always put your requests in writing, because otherwise elected officials are going to forget them. Your staffers all keep notepads like this. You don't want your request in their handwritten notepad scrawled based on their telephone phone call. Like, this is literally my congressional one here, but like, you don't want your request there. You want your request in their email that they have to clean out. So before I call my elected officials, I actually write out my request, what I want. I include the information that they need to do it. So if I have a 311 request I'm asking them to follow up on, if I have a description of what I want them to help me with an agency for, I have a funding request, I actually write it all out in an email beforehand. And then based on our conversation, I do little minor edits to my email and I have it in their inbox 10 minutes after we get off the phone. And it's a way for you to have them get that information in their heads. And then you can add any information they ask for, but you are also prepared to like have them, while they're thinking about you, while they want to follow up on your issue, you are putting the information in writing in front of them so that they can forward that email to where it needs to go. And so I always like to do the double. I like to talk to people and then I follow up with email. You can do the reverse, but depends on your relationship and how your elected officials, that office works. But pre-writing that information is very, very helpful in organizing your own thoughts so that you know what is it you're asking them to do. If not just, and I will say, try to tailor it. It's not just like, I want help with fill in the blank. It can be. If you can take that one step further and say, I want help with this street light that's out on our corner, this garbage pickup, and then say, can you therefore contact Department of Sanitation or DOT? If you can give them the action that you are looking for, you are more likely to get success because it is one less step that staffer has to take in order to deliver on what it is you're asking for. So if you could be clear, and I think Sarah shared this, sort of your goals, what you want, and then the outcome you're seeking, it is very helpful. And then organizing that into one straightforward email. Your contact information has to be in there. Your name has to be in there. The garden you're talking about, the address you're talking about, put it all in one spot, pre-hand it so they might ask for it over the phone, but then you can send it to them in an email so they have it in front of them, can forward it to the right staffer, agency, what have you, for follow-up, because that person is often not the actual person that has to actualize your thing. And then one of my final do's is thank them publicly. Put it on your Twitter, put it on your social media. Elected officials like praise. They like thank yous. It's a great way of building a relationship. Again, going back to like putting your partisan political aside thing there, that access to your community, that voice, that presence in your community is one of the things that attracts them to certain projects. So make sure that you are publicly thanking them. Anytime they do something good for you, you should be telling all your members, and then you should be showing them that you're telling all your members. If you send it out at e-blast to your membership list that says this elected official just helped us solve this problem, we should all thank them. You can then forward that message to them. You can include them on the message, however you want to do it, but make sure they know that you are expressing your appreciation, because they get 1,000 requests, literally 1,000 in any given month. Elected officials office, my previous office, we went through 3,000 cases a year of individual constituent cases. And that's besides any organizational things or anything like that. That was just individual constituents asking us for help. So be sure that you are showing your appreciation, because like it does matter. It moves your phone call up the stack of return phone calls. It gets you a response faster. It makes them more likely to follow up on your issue. With this, I will say the inverse, and this is where I'm going to get into my dotes. Do not attack your elected officials. Do not harass them. Do not badmouth them. Do not badger staff. Do not get on the phone and harangue them as much as you would like to. It does the opposite of publicly thanking them. It drops your phone call, your return phone call, your email to the bottom of the pile. Don't do it. It's just not worth it. You can, and I will say this, you can disagree with them. I'm not saying don't disagree with them. And I will talk about this more about that in a second. But do so in a polite, respectful way. They are your government officials, whether or not you like them, you have to treat them as such. They are representing your community. They were elected to represent your community. You have to give them that respect in all instances, always. Nothing will cause them to not pick you for funding or for anything than being openly disrespectful to them. It's just a truth of how elected politics works. I would also say to that, don't denigrate other applicants or their elected officials' other priorities. If they have an interest in schools or senior centers, or you know that other people are doing it and you think that they are not as important as your project, they very may well not be, to be totally frank. If you ever look at that list, sometimes there are some real doozies on there. But don't say it. It doesn't make you look good. It looks like there are lots of community priorities, there are lots of interests, and that's okay. And that's, you got to remember that they are balancing a lot of priorities, right? Again, you are competing against schools and senior centers and lots of other things, food giveaways, lots of other things that we would all consider very important pieces of our community. And with that, you don't, again, so this is the piece I will say, you don't have to agree with your elected officials. It can sometimes be helpful to respectfully disagree with your elected official. And I say this in very cautious terms. If they take a position on something that you don't like, or they are doing something that you disagree with, or that will harm your community garden or your local community, you should feel free to tell them that. But you have to do it in a respectful way. And I will say, you have to give them a path to doing the right thing. So like we had in my community garden, we have a lot of plastic bag trash, like a lot of plastic bag trash. We are full of plastic bags and picking up plastic bag trash. And this was a couple of years ago. And our local assembly member voted against the plastic bag ban bill in a way that we felt really was going to be unhelpful for us and our ability to maintain our community space. So we wrote to her and we said, we disagreed with this. We hope you'd support it in the future. Which allowed us to both express our disagreement, but also pointed to a pathway for what they could do to make it better in a very respectful way. She worked really hard for 2 years after that to be friendly to us and talk to us and engage with us. And it was because we were community group, we had community access. We didn't necessarily disagree. She, I think, knew that it was not necessarily the best decision. So she chose to go out of her way to help support us. And it's a way, it can be a way of opening a door if you are able to do it in a very respectful, kind, forthright manner. It is not a personal attack. You are disagreeing with a position, not a person. And there's a big distinction in there. And I would say with that, engaging with your elected officials, you don't have to just contain it to funding or before you engage with them. You can submit a lot of requests to your elected officials. I mentioned earlier, if you are having a trash problem, you can ask them to help you get sanitation to help do cleanups or dumping problems. They will come, sanitation will come pick things up off the sidewalk if you have a dumping problem. You have street problems, they will then help you get DOT to say fix a street light. If you have a problem with the DEP in your hydrant, they can help expedite all of that. And that engagement of you coming to them to ask for help is a great way of getting their help, getting them to know who you are and the services you offer, and build that reciprocal relationship where they help you, and then you can provide things like public praise to help support them. And I would say you should invite your elected officials to all your events. If you have a big garden meeting, invite them. They might come speak. They might come give them an update on their work. If you are having like a fall fest or a Halloween thing or a planting day, invite them. They love to know what you have going on. They like to know what's going on in their community, even if they don't attend. So just invite them. We invite our local electeds every time we have every time we have any sort of event where there's going to be people beyond our individual gardens there, we invite them. And it's worth doing so that they can see and be familiar with your work and the great work you do in the community. If you're doing food giveaways, they should know about it. If you have so many members, and you can engage with them and talk to them about that with that staff member again, about what they're interested in hearing about and how they want to receive that information. But it's worth getting them involved well beyond just asking for funding, so that by the time they are familiar with you, they know how good you are for the community, they know that frankly, and this is garden things, they know your roots in the community, so that when you get to the funding question, you're not convincing them about your value from step one, right? You're not saying, here's who we are, we have X number of members, that's all just like information on a page, and they're going to be comparing it across things. You want them to have a little bit more of a investment in your success, which is in part how asking them for help with other things, bringing them to events can have them get that personal touch, so that you, again, can jump up in that line for potential funding. And then I will say this, and Parks Department will mute me, I think, stay on the Parks Department as they do your funding, because you want to make sure that your money is actually going where it's supposed to go. Sometimes it won't. Be close on it.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was so much information. And thank you, Sarah. Both of you really enlightened us a lot in how this process goes and all of the different pathways and avenues that can happen. And what I've learned is that building relationships is a super important place to begin. Before we move to Q&A, Matt, Sarah, do you have anything else to add?
No, I did get one or two questions through the chat, but we can, do that on a rolling basis. That was great.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague, Bill, who will get us started with Q&A.
Okay, and Robert, OCs love follow-up, so absolutely, follow-up. Isn't that right, Ver Gibbs? Okay, so I've got some questions here, and I'm just going to scroll down. Some of them I think Mara might have actually posted a document on this. The first one is there any written guidance on the different types of funding and what items, projects qualify for those types of funding? I think, Mara, you posted a document, yeah?
Yeah, Matt and I posted a couple of links, and for the sake of this recording, for when we share it later, I'll be sure to put those links in the YouTube description below.
Okay, here's a question for Robert. What is the membership size of your garden, and did that make a difference in your pursuit of funds?
So we are, I think, somewhere between like 40 and 50 general members. We have about I will say 15 core members who do our work, which a concept I'm sure you were all familiar with. But I will say, I actually don't think it did. And the answer was that because our council member saw us coming from a literal trash lot in his community to becoming any sort of garden, we had already come so far that I think he was interested and willing to help us up front, knowing that we were on the path to grow and really help change and clean up a otherwise pretty gross corner in our community. And I say that living on the block for 11 years. So they knew he was invested in us, so that I didn't have to say, here's my membership. And I will caution, people talked about the idea of participatory budgeting, which is a process in which you can propose projects and then the community votes on it. that is a membership driven thing, right? Like that is about how many votes your organization can turn out into the council members voting system. And like gardens rarely win that. I won't say never, but rarely win it. If you're going up against a high school who's replacing their bathroom and they can have everyone over 16 in that high school vote, you're just like, you're not doing it. You're doing a daycare that has 100 parents who can do it, who want to replace a playground. You're never going to make it over the cut. So like, and that's where I think for gardens in particular, you got to target, you help them show you the benefit that you bring to the community in a really personal way, rather than necessarily relying on raw like data and the numbers for it. Although it certainly helps.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So let's see. How do you find out if a long-time vacant lot could possibly be a community garden?
We had one question before that I want to make sure it doesn't get
Oh.
lost. And then I'm happy to answer that one.
I might have missed it then, Mara.
Okay, no problem. So the question was, oh, I'm sorry, it was direct to me. That's why. I'm sorry, Bill. Does the borough president have an application process for their funding process, or do you just write them a letter addressed to whom? Matt, will you answer this one?
Yeah, I could take first pass. So specific to their, so they generally speaking, to my understanding, don't have a lot of, I don't believe they have access to discretionary expense funding in the way that council does. In the past, there were some kind of weird quirks, but I think we can leave that aside. But generally speaking, so their discretionary bundle is capital, and they don't have an application process because, again, that funding is not generally going to organizations or groups directly. It's going to city agencies. But so yes, I think letter of support is certainly one way to do that advocacy, or all the various strategies that Robert outlined very ably, making sure that the borough president, your local council member, obviously. There's no reason not to, your local BP might be a little busier because they cover a little more turf, quite specifically, but doesn't mean they shouldn't be engaged or interested, or maybe their staff drops by to kind of send the BP's regards, or and if they, and again, to all those other sort of great do's and don'ts that Robert attended. So the BP absolutely does provide really significant capital dollars on a year-to-year basis to city agencies, including parks. And much of that certainly goes towards garden improvements. So no reason why your local garden shouldn't be up for consideration for that.
And I will add, and this is my piece, call and ask. Don't be afraid to call your elected officials. They have people who answer the phones, who answer emails specifically to help guide you. And like, don't be afraid to ask them that question. That is a perfectly valid question to address to your individual borough president. All of them handle it slightly differently. So ask, engage. They represent you. They have people who are assigned to help cover your territory. Talk to them. It's like, don't be afraid. It shouldn't be, talking to your elected officials should not be a bar that's above anyone who's on this Zoom. You're all engaged in your community. Your elected officials are members of your community. Talk to them. Talk to them as if you would a neighbor. Respectfully.
Okay. always with respect, Robert, right? Here we have a question from Coffee. Can discretionary funding be used for educational workshops or events to cover the cost for educators and materials? Will discretionary funds always be a reimbursement model, or can the funds be given directly to an organization? A couple of questions here. That's good. Also, many gardens do not know about the initiatives like a Greener NYC or the Parks Equity Initiative. And thank you. And by the way, I can repeat them one at a time. That was great questions, everyone. Who wants to take the first one? Can discretionary funding be used for educational workshops or events to cover the costs for educators and materials? First question.
And Sarah, as an awardee, can chime in, with her perspective as an actual vendor / awardee. But I can, speaking to the council's rules and regulations, and I floated a link a little earlier that helps explain some of that. I would go further and say not only can it, but it should be used for programs and services. That the council actually has an internal rule that only a small portion of the award should be of their discretionary funding expense awards should be dedicated towards what we would call indirect administrative costs. It's really not meant to go towards base salary or rent or things of that nature. But what you can do is basically ascribe a portion. So let's say you're doing a, fall fair where, you're, doing educational workshops, things of that nature, that'll obviously some degree of work, salary, personnel costs may be a portion of that award, but by and large, it should be largely dedicated towards sort of the public facing benefits and impacts and services that are provided. So supplies that you needed to carry off the event, all that sort of, so generally speaking, yes, it can absolutely be used for educational workshops, things of that nature. In fact, that's definitely the council wants to see these awards primarily dedicated towards direct programs and services and events, things that are actually happening. And the focus is less supposed to be about sort of the administrative upside. For better or worse, it is a reimbursement-based model. And I know that can be a real challenge, especially for up-and-coming groups that are still building capacity. I don't know what to say about it. It's because it's tax dollars. It goes through a very strict, rigorous, review process. The application to go through this. These are city dollars, so to make sure that everything's done sort of according to existing rules and policies. That is. So there is a degree of capacity that a group needs to have the wherewithal to be able to front those costs, and that's no small thing. I don't take that lightly. And the agencies, and actually, if I don't want to sideline things. Well, I think folks have mentioned Parks Equity Initiative and Greener NYC. I think it's worth unpacking that a little bit because I actually did get a direct question about that. But before I do, Sarah, did you want to add anything about sort of the council's policies as an awardee from your perspective?
Yeah, I wanted to just echo what you had to say about the use of the funds for events or things like that. That's in terms of purchasing food for an event or purchasing any other materials that would help to make that event be successful. That's definitely something we've always found success in. And then in terms of covering the cost for educators, or there's an option in the funding to have a subcontractor. That's not something we've done because that's another layer of paperwork and just more difficulty for us. So as long as it's someone who's on staff with us, or someone who's even if that's a seasonal person, a part-time role, then those costs for someone to run a workshop, for example, can be folded in easily, as you were saying, Matt, into that. And then I wanted to raise a resource that we haven't used before, but we've looked into previously, which is the fund for the City of New York. And I'll drop a link to that here. And I'm dropping a link specifically to their cash flow program. And this is what they will provide bridge financing to nonprofit organizations who are awaiting reimbursement, basically, because a lot of times as you're waiting for a reimbursement, that time horizon can be a long time after you've already spent the funds. So for example, when the city's fiscal year the previous one ended June 30th, and we had done all of our spending from July 1 of 2020 through June 30th, 2021, we weren't reimbursed for that whole year's worth of discretionary funding until December of 2021. So that's a long time for an organization to have to float a lot of money to the city. It's not a good system, because it's the city as this giant entity is basically borrowing on the backs of nonprofit organization. That's not how it is intended, I'm sure, but that's sort of what it ends up resulting in, especially for a small nonprofit organization. And so that's why an organization Fund for the City of New York exists, because it's basically acknowledging this is an undue burden on nonprofit organizations. If your nonprofit is struggling with this, we can work with you to provide a bridge loan to make sure that you're not brought down by having to wait for so long for the city or the state or whatever, in this case, the city, to, you know, reimburse you for funds that you've already expended and that you have been committed to receiving back. I don't mean to be too harsh. It's just that's been our experience. And for a small nonprofit, it can be a long time. And a resource like this is something that we haven't used before. So I can't speak to what that is like using them, but it's something we've looked at. And I know other folks who have used this in the past. So it's a good thing to be aware of.
Thank you
Matt,
for sharing. And
Matt, do you want to talk about the Parks Equity Initiative? I
Yes.
think-
No, but Sarah, great point, and completely fair. I mean, it can take a very, very considerable time to navigate the reimbursement process, which isn't easy. You know, especially considering that all these garden groups are led by folks who have lives and families and jobs and all this other kind of stuff. So, our contract team, you know, do what they can. In their defense, they deal with a lot of incoming and a lot of volume because they're obviously dealing not only with these awards, but also the agency's purchasing processes writ large. You know, we're out there buying our own, you know, rakes and vehicles and all this other kind of stuff. So they do the best they can, obviously. But we loud and clear. I think that's a fair point. And the Fund for the City of New York is a wonderful organization. That's a great resource that they offer for sure. So yes, a couple people mentioned Parks Equity Initiative and a couple of other things. And so that's I'll quickly characterize that these are basically subcategories of council discretionary expense funding. So if you're a council member, you get assigned roughly several $100,000 of expense funding that you can sort of sprinkle around each year. And that's broken up into buckets. And some of them are ideologically or thematically linked. So there's an aging initiative where the allocation should be themed towards senior centers, things of that nature. There's a youth initiative for children's services, things of that. And then there are a couple, to more pointedly for us, there's a greener NYC, which is sort of environmentally themed allocations. It's a separate bucket. It all adds up to, I don't know, around $500,000 like per year, give or take. But it's broken in these constituent buckets. So as long as the allocation is, environmentally themed, and so Greener NYC is a great resource, specific allocation that the initiative that the council members can draw upon, as is cleanup, NYC cleanup, which is generally kind of sanitation related. So sort of garbage cans, things of that nature, but there can be some benefit there for gardens, certainly. And then the one that's most relevant to us and a fairly recent creation, it's only been around for about 4 or 5 years, is the Parks Equity Initiative. This is a newly created, the council, came together and decided to essentially create a new stream of expense funding that is specifically thematically linked to parks or open space goals. Doesn't mean that parks has to be the recipient, and it doesn't mean that it even has to be parks property that's impacted. It could be a state park. There are other, then the award goes through DYCD. I don't want to bore you, but because we're obviously chiefly concerned with city parks under our jurisdiction, but the initiative writ large can, as long as it's impacting positively, open space or park related things. So it's a dedicated stream of funding, and it varies from year to year depending on but I think the last COVID aside, pre-COVID and post-COVID, I think it's been around like $70,000 a year. So not bad. And it's each council district gets that little chunk, and it's to make sure that areas that don't have the resource to some of the, fancier conservancies or more well-heeled advocacy groups can still kind of have dedicated funds going directly to those nonprofits or to the agency in some cases to provide services and programs of that nature.
Thanks,
you.
Matt.
Go
ahead, Mara.
I know a lot of Parks Equity funding for community gardens comes through GreenThumb's office. And so if that's the case for your garden, you don't have to worry about the reimbursement situation. Your garden doesn't have to front the money. GreenThumb works all of that out.
Okay, here we've got another question. Can you describe working with NYCHA, public housing? They have lots of green space, but may have difficult bureaucratic hurdles to doing anything on their property.
Yeah, I don't know, Mara. Obviously, like just one of our sister agencies, and I know we've worked very closely with them, and in fact are engaging in some really fascinating partnerships. In terms of parks getting more involved on their property. That's a more recent effort. So, sure, they are indeed a huge organization, and I'm sure there are challenges there. But Mara, I don't know if you want to speak to that a little more.
I'm gonna let Robert speak to that. I think he knows.
So in my old position, I did a lot of work with NYCHA. So, and it's sort of like it's a fully separate, a little separate, not fully separate, but separate from the Parks Department. And I actually put a playbook in how to get a community garden or a garden going on NYCHA property that was created by the mayor's office in past history, or one of the mayor's offices for, I think, criminal justice reform or something. But it really actually starts with your property manager and talking to them. There are forms for you to apply to be able to get it. And from there are a whole series of steps and some supports that NYCHA can offer to help get a garden going. Involves like identifying an appropriate site and working with your property manager and resident engagement committee and your tenant association and that sort of thing. And I will say this, and I will append this to virtually everything I say, because maybe I'm not the only one who can say this. You might hit a snag somewhere along the way. Your property manager may not be responsive. NYCHA may sit on your application. Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid to ask your local elected officials for help in getting that through. Like, call them, say, it's been sitting here, it's been a couple of weeks, I haven't heard anything. Can you put in an inquiry for me to find out where this is? And it is the best and fastest way to get anything unstuck is for an elected official simply to ask where it is and what's taking so long. And so don't be afraid if you're trying to organize around NYCHA. Certainly there might be snags, but not anything that's unsurmountable if you are willing to call in some help from the outside to help you push things through.
I should also note that GreenThumb has been rolling out a program with NYCHA over the last couple of years. And if you want any more information about that, we'd be happy to answer questions after that. Let's see. How do you work in quotes, paying a stipend for a facilitator of a workshop without having them be a subcontractor?
This it's a great question, and I'm less just because I haven't navigated it from the vendor perspective, and I'm not a member of the contract staff, so I don't want to misspeak here. I know there. If the facilitator of the workshop is sort of part and parcel of the operational cost of having, pull off that program, I'm certain that is, that can be included, and there is a way to do that. When and how it's considered a subcontractor versus just like a regular program expense, I'm not as familiar with. I mean, the council does allow, just to clarify, they do allow subcontractors. They just I think they put like a general limit of around 30. They only want like about a third of the award at most to be used on subcontractors, but there's still other invoices, so let's say you go to Home Depot to buy a supply, so you turn in that, that receipt or that invoice, that sort of, so it all kind of, but in terms of an individual who's providing additional value, yeah, when and how that's considered a subcontractor, I apologize. I think between Mara and myself, maybe we can circle back to our contracts team and get you a little bit more of that detail there. I mean, I know in principle, certainly possible to get those expenses, included in the award. How it happens, I'm a little less familiar.
I also don't know the answer, so I think it's a good call. We can research, talk to our colleagues across the agency and get that answer.
I have a question that's not here, but it's mine. But I'm an OC, so I'm allowed to do this. Can several gardens come together, come up with, say a whole bunch of them want cameras or some item? Can they all come together and put in an expense that meets that $50,000 threshold?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is it depends, and certain things just by their nature, regardless of the cost or the ultimate cost, aren't going to be considered capitally eligible for the reason that they're not considered a comprehensive betterment. So I know this gets a little frustrating, but OMB and the comptroller basically have a set of directives and guidance that they use to determine capital eligibility. So whenever we sort of opine, we're just sort of using our best experience in terms of what's been determined capitally eligible in the past. Cameras are a little tricky. They're a bit of a gray zone. I know security cameras or other similar cameras that were part of a larger capital project were certainly included, and I believe deemed capitally eligible for that. But standalone cameras, even at multiple sites, so it adds up to 50,000 or more, I don't know, we'd have to double check. I suspect that wouldn't be capitally eligible, but I think your broader point is, can a set of gardens kind of like work together to sort of advocate for a broader sort of system-wide improvement? And the answer is definitely, especially if the recipient of the funding is meant to be the Parks Department, then that's certainly in fact many times advisable. Lower East Side is a great example. High density of community gardens in a smaller area, so it might make sense to kind of approach sidewalk repair or fencing or what have you in sort of a more holistic manner. And there's no reason, in coordination with the agency, with your outreach coordinator, talking through the strategy, no reason that couldn't be pursued.
I think there was a question about participatory budgeting. If we have room for one more question, Mara.
Yeah, I think we can do one more question. I know Matt talked a little bit about, and Robert both mentioned participatory budgeting, but let's do it real fast.
PBs. So the council over the last 10 or so years has conducted what they call the participatory budgeting process. In general, and this is often this is a little misunderstood quite often. It's not really additional money. It's not new money or different money. It's basically each council member deciding to dedicate a portion of their allocation, their discretionary allocation. They decide to basically subject a portion of it to this public-facing vote, essentially. And so there are delegates. They recruit delegates that live in their district, and the council conducts the number of members that have participated has changed over the years. It actually got pretty, I think at one point it was 40 out of the 51 members were participating a couple years ago, and then COVID hit, so they understandably dialed it down for a couple of years. So now this year's cycle, which is basically them starting it back up, it's 15 members out of the 51. But anyway, it will help inform their decisions of allocations for this upcoming fiscal year, what we call fiscal year 2023. Because you always name the fiscal year after the year in which it ends, which I didn't know till I started working here. But so that is live now. I think unfortunately the window has closed for submissions or proposals, but if you're interested in voting, if you're a resident of that district, I think there is a mechanism to get involved, and they may even still be accepting delegates to kind of help lead the discussion. I'm less familiar with those mechanics, but essentially it's a subdivision of the allocations that they make on an annual basis. They essentially, they put up a portion of it and they say, okay, we're going to take direct input over this portion of PB. So looking ahead to fiscal year 2024, getting involved early, and I think this ties into everything Robert was discussing. If you're kind of keeping your council member engaged, there will come a moment at which they'll kind of put the word out for, hey guys, we're getting the next PB cycle, get up and running. No reason not to get in the front door and make sure that a garden specific project is on the table. Or, if there's other things, tree planting, sidewalk repair, playground improvements, whatever, no reason not to have your voice heard and be a part of that for sure.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you so much, Sarah and Robert. Tonight was an incredible session. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone did too who joined in tonight. My colleague Bill, thank you so much for managing the Q&A, and please check the chat. He put a link into our upcoming virtual GreenThumb Grow Together conference. It is in 2 parts this year. We're doing a virtual week and then an in-person week in April. So please stay tuned for that as well. We're excited for this growing season. We're going to hopefully be back in the community gardens outside safely, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much for coming tonight.